What's the better way to handle and manage device identity than using just a username and password? Well, the better way, and actually the default way when we try to communicate with AWS IoT, is to use the private key and corresponding certificate. The private key is essentially just a random string that is not that interesting, but very, very important, and we should keep it secure and confidential at any stage. The certificate, on the other hand, is not confidential. This is something that we can share with everyone because the certificate consists of the metadata and the public key that corresponds to the private key. This is how the certificate looks inside, and without going into much details, I would like to mention the most important parts that we should notice, and I want to show how certificate is more secure by default than using the username and password. Let's start with the issuer. When we've got a certificate, we've got the issuer of that certificate, and that is basically the identity that signed or created that certificate. So in this case, that is the Amazon Web Services. And if you trust the Amazon Web Services, then that trust propagates to this certificate and to the owner of that certificate. Then we've got the subject, and this is something extremely important. In this case, we use the common name field of device A. Within the certificate itself, we've got the information about the identity represented by this certificate, which in our case is device A. When you've got a password, there is no relation between the identity and the password connected to that identity, other than some external database that is hosted in other system. When you use certificate, that relation between the identity and certificate is embedded into certificate itself, and I think that's a huge value on its own. Then we've got the validity. So certificate is valid only between a specified dates. This is very, very important because when you use a password, you do not really know if that password is valid or not. There is nothing like expired password by default, or not something that you can understand just by looking at the password itself. In the certificate, we've got the time range between which this certificate is valid. And of course, there are methods to rotate certificates, and maybe this certificate is no longer valid even though the time range embedded into the certificate defines something else. But still, I think it's a value added that we know the date range when this certificate is supposed to be valid, instead of having just a password that does not contain that information on its own. And then we've got the usage of the key embedded into certificate. So this is additional information that we've got within certificate itself that gives us some insights about how this specific certificate should be used by the identity that owns it. So in our case, the device. So as you can see, just by going through some set of attributes within the certificate, we've got way more information about the identity that is represented by the certificate compared just to a random string, which is a password. And we've got all of that embedded into certificate. We don't have to go to any external system, any external database to obtain that additional data. It is all included into the certificate.